started with the snow. Not the gentle, picturesque flakes that blanket the world in tranquility, but a furious torrent, an unrelenting blizzard that screamed across the horizon, obliterating everything in its path. The wind howled like a living thing, slamming against cars and buildings, while the sky seemed to collapse under the weight of endless white. They called it the blizzard of the century, but for me it became something far worse. It became a nightmare. I was driving home from a conference in Denver. The forecast had warned of bad weather, but I figured I could beat it. Just a few hours on the highway, and I'd be back in my cozy apartment in Boulder. The first flakes began falling as I merged onto I-70. By the time I hit the foothills, the world was a swirling chaos of white. Visibility dropped to zero. Cars ahead vanished into the storm. The highway became a graveyard of abandoned vehicles. Panic clawed at my chest. I couldn't stop here. I'd freeze to death, but I couldn't see, couldn't think. I kept driving, crawling at a snail's pace until I saw the faint glow of lights through the storm. A sign loomed into view: Cedarwood Motel, vacancy. Relief flooded through me. I pulled into the lot, skidding on the icy pavement. The building was old, the paint peeling, but it was shelter. I grabbed my bag and stumbled through the snow to the office. The clerk was an older man with a lined face and weary eyes. He didn't ask for my name, just handed me a key and pointed me toward room 8. The room was small but warm, with a rattling radiator and a bed that sagged in the middle. I didn't care. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and collapsed into the bed, hoping to sleep through the storm. But the storm had other plans. I woke to a soft tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, howling through the gaps in the window frame. But as I strained my ears, I realized the sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone tapping on glass. My heart quickened as I turned toward the window, but the thick curtains blocked any view. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. I fumbled for the lamp and turned it on. The room was empty. The door was still locked, the curtains drawn. I walked to the window and hesitated before pulling the curtains aside. The snow outside was falling in dense sheets, and for a moment I saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed footprints in the snow outside my window. They led to the edge of the building and disappeared into the storm. I told myself it was nothing, probably a maintenance worker or another guest. But as I lay back down, unease settled over me. The tapping didn't return that night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I told the clerk about the footprints. He shrugged it off. "Storm like this, footprints get covered quick. You're probably imagining things," he said. His nonchalance unsettled me, but I didn't press further. The storm hadn't let up, and the highway was still closed. I returned to room 8, determined to distract myself. But as night fell, the unease grew. I double-checked the locks, drew the curtains tightly, and kept the lamp on. Despite my precautions, the tapping returned, louder this time, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window. My hands trembled as I pulled the curtains aside. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, I saw him. A figure, barely visible through the storm, stood just outside the window. He was motionless, his face obscured by the blizzard, but I could feel his gaze boring into me. "Who are you?" I shouted, backing away from the window. The figure didn't move. I turned to grab my phone, and when I looked back, he was gone. The snow outside the window was pristine, undisturbed. My stomach churned. I hadn't imagined it. The third night was worse. I'd barricaded the door with a chair and stayed up clutching a flashlight. The storm still raged, and every creak of the building set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Not tapping this time, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could hear faint breathing on the other side. My heart pounded as I grabbed the chair, ready to defend myself. Then, the doorknob rattled, followed by a low chuckle. "Go away," I shouted. The rattling stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, but whoever it was didn't leave. I peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Only silence remained, heavy and oppressive. When the storm finally broke, I fled. I didn't even check out, just threw my bag in the car and drove, the tires skidding on the ice. As the motel disappeared in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. That night, as I lay in my apartment, I heard it again. the tapping on my window. I froze, too terrified to move. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. Outside my window, through the faint reflection of my own terrified face, I saw him. His eyes glinted with malice, and his smile widened, as if he'd been waiting for me all along. It started as a typical winter evening in the mountains of Colorado. The forecast had warned of a snowstorm, but as someone who had grown up in these parts, I'd learned to treat such warnings with a healthy dose of skepticism. Snowstorms here were as regular as the setting sun, and most of the time, they passed without much incident. This one, though, was different. I was staying at a secluded cabin I'd rented for a week-long retreat. Life back in the city had been chaotic. Work deadlines, a recent breakup, and the relentless noise of urban life had drained me. The cabin, nestled deep in the forest and miles away from the nearest neighbor, seemed like the perfect place. It was rustic but cozy, with a wood-burning stove, a stack of firewood, and enough provisions to last me weeks, if necessary. The first flakes began to fall just after sunset. I was sitting by the fire, nursing a mug of hot cocoa, when I glanced out the window and saw the world outside being blanketed in white. The scene was picturesque, almost magical. I'd even stepped out onto the porch to take a few photos of the snow-covered trees, the sharp chill of the air invigorating. But by the time I'd finished my cocoa, the gentle snowfall had turned into a howling blizzard. The wind roared like a freight train, rattling the windows and whistling through the gaps in the cabin's walls. I could barely see a few feet beyond the glass. The world outside had dissolved into a swirling chaos of white. I added more logs to the fire and tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. Storms like this were normal, I reminded myself. By morning it would pass, and the forest would be silent and serene once more. But the storm didn't pass. By the next morning, the snow had piled up so high it buried the first few steps of the porch. The wind had died down, but the sky remained a heavy, leaden gray, and the air was eerily silent. I tried to open the front door to step outside and assess the situation, but it wouldn't budge. Snow had drifted against it overnight, sealing me inside. I wasn't too concerned at first. I had enough supplies, and the cabin had a sturdy wood stove to keep me warm. If I needed help, my cell phone, with its signal booster, was my lifeline. But when I reached for my phone, I saw something that made my heart sink. No signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. Over the next few hours, I busied myself shoveling snow away from the door using an old metal shovel I'd found in the shed. It was grueling work, and the cold bit at my fingers and toes, but I finally managed to clear enough to open the door and step outside. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were faint, partially obscured by the falling snow, but unmistakable. A trail of human footprints leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the forest. My first thought was that someone had been caught in the storm and sought shelter near my cabin, but I hadn't heard anyone knock. Surely, I would have heard them over the howling wind, wouldn't I? The tracks were strange, too. They didn't lead directly to or from the cabin. Instead, they meandered around it, circling the perimeter several times before heading off into the woods. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I called out, my voice echoing into the stillness. "Hello? Is someone there?" No reply, just the soft whisper of snow falling all around me. I followed the tracks for a short distance, curiosity and unease battling for control in my mind. But after a few yards, they abruptly stopped. It was as if whoever had made them had turned back or blended into the forest, obscured by the snowfall. I scanned the area, my breath visible in the freezing air, but the forest remained silent. I hurried back to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe the wind had obscured the rest of the trail, or maybe... No, I couldn't think of any other explanation. That night, the unease grew into full-blown fear. The storm returned with a vengeance, battering the cabin with relentless fury. I huddled by the fire, every creak and groan of the wooden walls setting my nerves on edge. And then, around midnight, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound came again, louder this time. Knock. Knock. It wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the window. Grabbing the fireplace poker, I crept toward the sound, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The knocking stopped as I approached, and when I peered through the frosted glass, there was nothing there. Just the swirling snow and the dark shapes of the trees beyond. I told myself it was the wind, even though I knew better. I'd seen the footprints. Someone was out there. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fear and isolation. The storm raged on, unrelenting, and I began to feel like a prisoner in my own mind. At night, I'd hear faint noises, scratches, thuds, and what sounded like someone brushing against the cabin walls, always just out of sight. During the day, I'd find more footprints, always circling the cabin, but never approaching the door. Sleep became impossible. I stayed awake by the fire, clutching the poker and jumping at every sound. The food and water I'd brought with me remained untouched. My stomach was in too many knots to eat. On the fourth day, I found something new. Near the porch, a metal tin, one I didn't recognize, lay half buried in the snow. Inside were scraps of paper, old and weathered, with what appeared to be fragments of journal entries. One of them read, "They're watching. Always watching." My stomach churned as I stared at the tin, a cold sweat breaking out despite the freezing air. On the fifth night, something changed. I was sitting in the dark, the fire reduced to embers, when I heard a voice. It was soft, barely audible over the howling wind, but it was unmistakably human. "Let me in," it said. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. The voice came again, louder this time. "Please, it's so cold out here. Let me in." It was coming from the front door. I hesitated, my grip on the poker tightening. What if it was someone who truly needed help? What if I was letting my paranoia put another life at risk? But then I remembered the footprints. The way they circled the cabin, like a predator stalking its prey. The voice came again, pleading, desperate. "Please, I'm freezing. Let me in." Something about it was off. The tone, the cadence, it didn't sound quite right, like someone struggling to speak clearly through the cold. I backed away from the door, shaking my head. "Go away," I shouted. "Leave me alone." The voice fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then, slowly, deliberately, the knocking began again. This time, it was on different sides of the cabin, as if someone was circling, testing the structure. A deliberate, methodical sound that made my blood run cold. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out from fear or exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The storm had finally passed, and sunlight streamed through the windows, but the relief was short-lived. The snow outside was littered with footprints, hundreds of them, all leading away from the cabin and into the forest. And carved into the wooden door, deep and jagged, were 3 words: "Stay inside." I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I grabbed what little I could carry and left that place behind, trudging through the snow until I reached the nearest road and flagged down a passing car. It's been months since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the knocking. Every time I look out the window, I expect to see those footprints. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. Whoever was out there that night, they're still out there, and they're waiting.